Okay. Um, when I was asked to look into the history of these houses, I thought it'd be a good thing to do because they are distinctive and popular. And you can see them here on this old 1862 map. There's the Promenade, there's Robin Hood Terrace, and here's Campbell Grove. But I also thought that it was quite an easy job to do, and it turns out I was wrong about that. And I was wrong about that because they were built before a time when building plans had to be submitted to the local authority, and their development was part of a very controversial issue which had been going on for Nottingham for about 60 years. So that's good news for us because it gives us an interesting story, but it has made it hard work to find out what was going on when they were built. So in order to understand that, we need to go back and see what Nottingham was like with its fields. And if we go back to this 1831 map of Nottingham, we can see a growing industrial town bursting at the seams. It's desperate to build on its neighbouring fields. It's struggling to do so, and as a result, Nottingham is that it's a very tight-knit and dense town, and one that we're still quite familiar with today in certain areas, such as lanes coming off the Angel Row area of Market Square. Our location is just northeast of the town centre, and we will look at that in closer detail in a moment. But before we do, I think it's important to reflect on the three field system that surrounded the town, and this schematic map of Nottingham in the Middle Ages gives us some impression of what it would have been like, and still existed up until in some variation up until the 19th century. So, for example, you have the Meadows, which was always called the Meadows. In here you have the Lingdale field, also called the Sand Field, and the Wood Field, also known as the Clay Field. And our area was built on the Clay Field. And if you were to go back in time and walk this area, you would see that the lay of the land would be quite familiar. So, for example, St Answell Road following this old trackway, this field boundary here, Robin Hood Street today, Bath Street following this boundary, and this boundary here between these two fields is the same boundary between the promenade and the recreation ground. And it is quite a feature of Victorian Nottingham how when it built on its fields, it followed the old field pattern. And it's a situation that's been remarked upon by national historians such as W.G. Hoskins, who was quite famous in the 1960s and 70s. So that's the situation here and what it looks like with its field system. And this is what it looks like from the ground. This is a image of Nottingham from the northeast. So on the clay field, a bit more further north than our location, possibly at Bellevue Reservoir. And you can see a few things. You can see that the topography of these fields is very attractive. You can see two gentlemen here, possibly freemen, enjoying probably the last summer's afternoon on these fields before they were built. And in the distance, you can see lots of chimney stacks of this growing industrial town, Nottingham in the distance. Familiar locations such as St Mary's Church on the hill of the Lace Market, and the castle on its rock over there. And this picture also represents that controversy which had been raging in Nottingham since the 18th century. And that was a controversy between two groups of people, one of whom was pro-enclosure, pro-building, and they were lace industrialists and social reformers. And for them, it was about improving Nottingham's commercial prospects and improving housing. And they were anti-enclosure group, who were anti-building on the fields, and they were freemen. Freemen were numbered about 3,000 people, and they had rights, agricultural rights to use the fields around the town. And they did this in exchange for supporting a political oligarchy of landlords and hosiery merchants. So it was a situation that had existed since the late 18th century, and it seems if you read, say, Chambers' book on 18th century Nottingham, it seems to have been the case because there was a dispute in the hosiery trade in the late 18th century, and it was a way of the hosiery merchants avoiding increasing regulation in that trade. But by the 1840s, it seemed to many that the situation should not continue, and there was growing pressure to build on the fields. Those who were anti-building on the fields were still sort of very, very adamant about keeping things as they were. And here is a picture, a sort of anti-enclosure painting, if you like, by William Malbom of Joseph Fenton and his family. And here a landlord is really showing a painting not only for his own family history, but also to show how much he enjoys using the fields for his own purposes. His facial expression looks rather resigned. He seems resigned to the future. By then, if you read the newspaper accounts, it seemed like this situation was not going to continue for much longer. And he's also asked the artist to depict dark clouds in the distance in the town of Nottingham. And those dark clouds were there not only because there was a lot of opposition to that kind of view, but also because there were growing industrial slums, and they were quite infamous, particularly those in Narrow Marsh. There's a diagram showing what they would have looked like. Arranged around a courtyard, back to back, and shared privies. A privy was a toilet, but it wasn't a flushing toilet, it was a wooden bucket. You didn't have running water in your accommodation, you had a tap which you shared with your neighbours. This sort of situation exacerbated poor health conditions and deaths during the cholera epidemic of the 1830s. Pro-enclosure group were often represented by this gentleman, Thomas Hawksley, who was in charge of the Nottingham Waterworks Company. And for him, as I've said before, with the lace industrialists, it was important to build on the fields to improve health and housing, but also improve commercial prospects. So finally, 1845, this argument that had been going on since the 1780s was at an end, because a government act had been passed saying it was now a possibility to build on the fields. In order to get the act through and to see through the consequences of the act, an enclosure committee had to organise the enclosure process and appease opposition. And here you can see that the freemen have been given various plots of land, often desirable plots, such as this one, because it neighboured a earmarked recreation ground. And they were given these plots of land because then the freemen could sell this land to speculative builders. And that recreation ground wasn't originally called Victoria Park. That name came later. It suggests here it was originally called Meadow Platt Cricket Ground, and the name Meadow Platt possibly goes back to the Middle Ages. I think the name means low-lying and often a wet land. And then neighbouring this, you've got St Anne's Cemetery, and this predates all of this enclosure process by about 10 to 15 years. And it was a overspill cemetery for the cholera epidemic, donated by a Quaker and philanthropist, who also, you can see named here, Samuel Fox. He's been given this allotted part in the enclosure process. So it's all quite interesting. When you see this document, it's such an interesting map. There's so much more to study, but you can see how this location was really embroiled in the whole enclosure controversy. So it was on this allotment, number 82, where you would get the Promenade, Campbell Grove and Rubin Terrace. So finally, building work begins. And here's a map of Nottingham, 1831. Sort of seen it before, but just to pull back and look at the sheer scale of it. That situation would have remained the same up until, say, the late 1840s, early 1850s. And by 1861 or 2, you've got a complete change in the built environment of Nottingham, a really huge building boom taking place on the sandfield, the clay field, and the meadows. And to some historians, I think it's in one of Asa Briggs's books, this building boom was one of the biggest in the country at that time. And really it was a potential development which had been held back for such a long time. And you can see why the scale of it happened in such a way and so quickly. If you were a builder from a neighbouring town in the Midlands, you rushed to Nottingham during this time because you knew you could, there was opportunity to make some money. So you had builders with pound signs coming from all over the place, Grantham or Derby, and there were disputes in the local sort of trade unions and trade groups over builders undercutting each other and that sort of thing. So it was very wild. And then you had the enclosure process as well. And some of it was quite good, and some of it was some good planning, such as the Arboretum, Elm Avenue, and Bellevue Reservoir, Robin Hood Chase, and then down here, Queen's Walk, and the houses which neighboured this sort of green ring, rather incomplete in some ways. These houses were really good, and one of those, of course, is our location. But of course, some of the housing wasn't, and this would cause problems almost straight away, and would continue to cause problems right up until the 1960s and 70s. Many people were quite impressed by this development and said that things like Nottingham is the Manchester of the Midlands. And it certainly would have seemed like that because Manchester was famous for being the sort of boom city of the 1830s, and here another boom is happening in Nottingham. But for others who were more critical, it was a grand opportunity lost. And one criticism was that the factories should have been zoned in the meadows, and all the housing, such as that was in Arboretum, should have been put in Arboretum or and St Anne's. Instead, what you get in places like Radford and St Anne's is a very close relationship between industry and housing. And this is a really good example. This is William Winderley's silk mill. It's right next to the Promenade and the recreation ground. And the extension, which was built later, is still with us, and that's a very attractive building. But the original building, which is contemporary with our houses, that's no longer with us. Finally, not finally, in 1852, the freemen are attempting to sell their plot of land. And they've got a surveyor and architect to draw up the plan, and they're attempting to sell it at auction. And the layout is recognisable, but there's also some key differences, such as Stanfield Street, for example, which would never materialise. And the actual scale of the lots are rather large, and it suggests they may have been asking for a higher value of house than what the market was willing to accept. This auction, it failed, and the freemen had to go back to the drawing board. A few years later, or 4 years later, John Holloway, he purchased this plot of land from the freemen on a 99-year lease, and building work began. So there was another gap, it seems, between that failed auction and 1856. And if you read the freemen's meeting accounts in the newspapers, they blamed the depression in the trades, in the building trade, on the Crimean War, which was taking place. It's quite interesting just to note the Crimean War, because it seems that the Campbell Grove was named after I think it was a General Campbell, who was quite popular during that war. Here's the new detail from the newspaper, where I was able to dig that detail out. And it's really thanks to the newspapers and the census records that I was able to piece together what was going on. So whereas usually what you do is you go to the archives and you get the building plan, and it'll tell you who owns the land and who's developing it, and show you the design, the builder, and so on. That's not possible with this set of housing, because it was built before that process was a legal requirement, and it was built during this sort of very wild and speculative moment. But anyway, this resource is quite useful if you wish to find out more or dig into local newspapers yourself. Then in 1862, we can see that most of the housing that we recognise today is complete. However, this block here, which faces Robin Hood Street, hasn't been complete. And if you go there today, they do look a little bit different. It seems that they came later in the 1860s. So most of the houses, therefore, are built in that late 1850s, early 1860s period. If we look at the census records, we find that our builder, John Holloway, is living on Watergate in the lace market. He would not have had far to walk to work. It's quite interesting when you start looking into the census records and seeing, looking at the Holloway family history. John Holloway came from Leicestershire, so he came to Nottingham to take part in to earn money in that building boom which was taking place. And he was living in Watergate, which is sort of close to the very heart of the lace market, and you can see Watergate coming off the right here. And this photograph shows you how busy this area would be, with lace workers coming in and out of the lace warehouses. This photograph was taken in 1914, but it would have been a very similar scene throughout the late 19th, mid to late 19th century. And it also shows you how it's highly likely that Holloway would have been familiar with the lace industry, its workers, and the kind of housing they wanted and could afford. In 1859, we learn that his son, William Holloway, is working with John, and he's living at number 25 Promenade, and he's acting as an estate agent, and he's renting out the houses. You also learn what was in the houses on the Promenade, and it says Several houses to be let containing drawing room, parlour, kitchen, scullery with copper, hard and soft water, 3 bedrooms, and fitted cupboards and closets, private yard and front garden. So really quite good facilities that sort of aspiring working class people would have wanted to afford, probably also lower middle class as well. There's the newspaper article. You would have found that information. And if you look at the census records, this familiarity between builder and lace industry seems ever more likely, such as 1 Campbell Grove. The earliest occupants were associated with the lace trade. The census records confirm that the most common occupation for the first 60 years that these houses were inhabited, most common occupation involved working in the lace trade. So it's important, I think, just to reflect on that industry just briefly, because it gives you some indication of the social makeup of this area. And the lace industry was quite different from a number of other Victorian industries. Let's take mining, for example, in that there was a high proportion of female employees, and they were often tasked with clipping, finishing, dressing and mending the lace, and it gave them a degree of autonomy which was unusual in Victorian Britain. And this was autonomy in that they had their own money and they were less dependent on the male head of the household. It's a feature that's often been commented on in various other areas right up into the 20th century. So you get the famous legend that existed in the 20th century that there were more women than men in Nottingham. And then people coming up into Nottingham in the 1950s, such as Richard Silburn, who was very, very taken aback and in a pleasant way in how many women were going to pubs on their own or with each other, whereas traditionally there were a lot of pubs in other areas in the country which would say you're not allowed to enter this pub without being escorted with a man. So quite interesting, got this sort of this female power happening in the lace industry, even though, of course, you know, for the comparative amount of labour they did compared to the men, they would have been paid less. At the same time, our houses at the Promenade were being built. The Adams Lace Warehouse on Stony Street was being built, and so were Birkin's Lace Warehouse. So at the time this building boom is taking place, the lace industry is booming. There's a lot of economic activity happening. For the men who worked in the lace industry, and they stood to earn comparatively with other industries quite a lot, and it was seen as a highly skilled job, working with very complex machines, and you had good pay, good hours of work, and the factories were relatively well lit and well kept. So it's quite interesting to think about how the lace industry and how aspirant it was. And then, this is the kind of housing that they want along the Promenade, Campbell Grove and Robin Hood Terrace. The fortunes of this district, of these houses, seems to chime with the lace industry, in that there was a great Victorian boom, but by the 1920s, the area was in decline in some ways. So, for example, if we look at this photograph, we see quite an attractive group of houses, and it seems like a very pleasant place in which to live. with corner shops and so on. But then if you look closely, you can see the Methodist chapel is boarded up, which is common with the decline of church going on, but also suggests perhaps a decline in population, or people moving out, or people with enough time to commit to such activities. And similar with this photograph here, the row on the right on first inspection seems pleasant enough, but on the left we see a vacant looking building on Campbell Grove. It would be nice to find out more about these photographs and how accurate they are, and their dates and so on. These are all pulled out of the picture archives, because sometimes people say that the areas only declined when they were earmarked for demolition or refurbishment. So it'd be interesting to find out more about that. And similar with this photograph as well, which shows a great deal of disrepair on Campbell Grove. The opportunity with this project has been to look at photographs at a high resolution. So with this photograph of the Promenade, we can quickly see that they were not originally painted. They were not stucco. When John Holloway built them, they were built with facing red brick. You can also see sort of patchwork repairs over the years, and perhaps these buildings, it seems perhaps in need of restoration work. By the mid 20th century, particularly after the Second World War, a lot of inner city districts throughout Britain were feeling rather neglected, either by landlords or local authorities, and they were complaining to their councillors that the housing wasn't up to scratch, and it wasn't with the necessary amenities that were expected at that time. Studies were done showing that most houses often lacked basic facilities such as running hot water or baths in places like St Anne's. And the City Council in Nottingham at that time favoured a wholesale clearance solution to this. The Nottingham City Council, under a Conservative administration, around the early 1970s, requested the services of Wimpey, who they worked with. Wimpey are a major national builder today. And Wimpey's favoured approach to this problem was to clear as many houses down as possible and rebuild the entire area in a Radburn model, with expressways and pedestrian routes away from major roads, but preserving our recreation ground. However, it seems likely, looking at this map, that the houses were earmarked for demolition. I think they partly missed out on demolition because they were not number one on the phasing list. So when you do such a big area, you do it in sections, and so it was way down the phasing list. And by the time they got around to it, the whole process had built up such opposition that change was in the air. And you can see why when you look at this photograph, that for a lot of people, the clearances of St Anne's was shocking and extreme. and then a more sensitive approach should have been conducted. I mean, just the sheer scale of it: 10,000 houses demolished, 30,000 people rehoused, and 5,000 new houses built. You know, it's really, really big, and one of the biggest clearance and redevelopment schemes happening in the country at that time. It's a great photograph, by the way, because it shows the old St Anne's coming down and Victoria Centre going up. But I think with housing, you have to be open to different points of view. You can't be dogmatic. You're dealing with thousands of people, thousands of houses. You could never know it all. And indeed, when you look at what was built in St Anne's, you read a lot of people's accounts, and for them, despite all the problems, the new housing gave them a better standard of living. This photograph depicts that quite neatly, but you can also see some of the criticism at the time that the Wimpy wholesale model was too regimented and didn't work with that beautiful St Anne's lay of the land. So as I've sort of alluded to before, this whole clearance model, this whole demolition and rebuilding model was being questioned throughout the country in that late 60s, early 70s period. And by this point, the government were offering funds through general improvement area grants. So a local authority could say, right, okay, we've got an area which needs improving, apply for some money, and then get the houses refurbished. And Promenade, Campbell Grove, and Robin Hood Terrace was one of the first GIAs in the country. I think alongside other locations such as Corporation Oaks and places like that. This article is from a East Midlands Architecture Journal in the 1970s, and the whole journal is dedicated to housing refurbishment for that particular issue, not just in the Promenade, but also other locations in the inner city. And it goes into quite a good degree of detail, showing what had been done and who had done it and when. Here's some of those pictures blown up. So you can see the GIA area as it was earmarked, and the car park, which was planned. So that was a new development. The works involved significant survey work done by Selleck Nicholas Williams Limited, a Cornish firm famous for their prefabricated concrete council housing. Often, I think you can often see that in mining areas. But here they are, they've been commissioned to survey these houses, and they find that there's, I think, about 7 different types, depending on what alterations have taken place. And what they're looking at is they're looking at how the new heating facilities, how the new electrical upgrades, how the new bathrooms can be successfully fitted and adapted. This photograph shows the sort of the change in layout of the kitchen, for example. So the old sash window is gone. And at the front of Robin Hood Terrace, you can see repointed brickwork, new doors, misplaced old downpipes moved out the way, and new downpipes put in. And the council generally did the retaining walls and the trees and the car parks, whereas the actual building refurbishment work, the sash windows and the chimney stacks and so on, that was done by a firm from Mansfield Woodhouse. And here it's quite interesting. You can see the promenade gets, as a result of this GIA work, the promenade gets liquor paint for the first time on the exterior front elevation. And that paint job that was first done wasn't multicolored, it was just red. I assume to hide that patchwork, brickwork that had been there as a result of repairs over more than 100 years. And again, here's another view looking towards Robin Hood Terrace, but along the promenade. If you compare it with some of those old photographs I showed you earlier, you can see that some of the bay windows got ripped out. Whether some of the bays were original or not, I don't know. It would be nice to find out. And here you get a nice view of the promenade, and you can see how all the houses have been painted, but it's all one tone. It would be nice to sort of colorize this image, I think, perhaps. You know, also see the chimney stacks, they've been refurbished. I assume this man with the ladder has just finished some of the works, but I don't know for sure. If you'd like to source some of these photographs, this is where I've got them from. It's Nottingham's Picture Archive, Picture Nottingham. And all of this sort of research I've done so far, it's a little bit top down and it's authoritative, and it's quite dry. And it would be nice to find more about these houses and what it was like to live there, but I'm able to get some sense of some idea through the census records. By the way, I use this website, Find My Past, for digging with the census records. Really quite good to work with, I find. And I'll just give you a few snippets for the moment. So here's an attempt to look at, I looked at a sample of about 17 houses. If I did all 95, I think it would take me a very, very long time, but I looked at a sample of about 17, and again, just to reiterate, I think the most common occupation listed for that first 60 years of these houses involves the lace trade. It's a bit difficult to look at. I mean, you can use the 1939 register for finding stuff out, but in the 20th century, obviously, it's very difficult, the last half of the 20th century, to find information on occupation because those census records haven't been released. So these names here, they're using electoral rolls. I found that at number 28 Promenade, there's a very interesting family that shows you the sort of the autonomy of women in the lace trade quite succinctly, where the Bradshaw family, who were always headed by women from 1871 up until the Edwardian period, and originally most of the trades were in the lace trade. Eventually they become property owners and live off their own means, which suggests they've become landlords. Which houses they owned, I don't know, or whether it was just this one when they lived off the rent, I'm not sure. But even so, what you've got here is an impression of, like as I said before, the autonomy or potential power of women in the lace trade in Nottingham. And you can also see some decline by looking at occupation. So at number 2, the Promenade, those early years, headed by shopkeepers. But by the 1939 register, we can see that it's been divided into 3 houses, and those occupants were in generally seen as less skilled trades and probably with less spare cash. So perhaps the houses become of lesser value. Migration, I only looked at a sample of 17, and so and I very rarely went beyond that. It seems that most people migrated from the East Midlands, Nottinghamshire. It kind of chimes with the history of the Leys trade. It's closely associated with hosiery, and that was in the 18th and 19th century, most dominant in the East Midlands. It did have connections to the southwest occasionally, so it's quite interesting to see some migration from Somerset. I did occasionally look outside the sample and see names from Germany, for example, but maybe I think it needs further study really to get a richer picture. And you can also see the effects of the general improvement area. And it seems, looking at the electoral rolls, that most people in this district moved out during the general improvement area works. So, for example, Lila Coker, who's been living there since the 50s, still there in the 8 Campbell Grove in 1971, but she's no longer listed as living there in 1981. Of course, I might be, quite wrong about the whys and wherefores. I'm just sort of basing it on the information to hand, really. But then you do find there's some people who stayed, such as William Wells, who's listed at living at 8 Robin Hood Terrace in 1961, and he's still there in 1981. So that's sort of it really, but I'll leave with some oral history questions, just because it might help. I don't want to dictate the story. I don't dictate the oral history questions, but sometimes if you give something, you might get something in return. And one question is, what was it like to live here before and after the GIA? A lot of people think that that GIAs were a good thing, and that it's an idea that could be given greater emphasis today, for example. How has the area changed during the time you have lived here? So even if it doesn't cover it, if your story doesn't cover any of the themes that I've touched upon, that's still of value. And are there any other stories and images you would like to share? I mean, I've heard a few interesting things on the grapevine, which give far greater flavour, I think, than things I've said. But please don't be afraid to add your story. So that's it from me. Thank you very much for listening. I hope sorry about my dry throat. I'm going to go away and have a big cup of tea now. If you'd like to know more about what I've been talking about, all the events that we've been doing, please check out our website. Thank you very much.